Welcome to this Prepare for IELTS video in which we're going to show you how to connect ideas. If you can use language to connect ideas in your essay, this is very good for your coherence and cohesion grade. We'll look at all the different ways in which you can connect ideas. So we'll start off by looking at how to add information and give a list of arguments. Then we'll look at describing results, reasons and purpose before looking at contrast and concession. After that, we'll look at how to describe a similarity and giving examples. Then we'll move on to introducing a new topic, introducing a new focus and giving emphasis before looking at describing your level of analysis, commenting on what you write, summarizing, and some typical mistakes such as overuse, formality, the use of because, and punctuation. So we'll start with one of the most common things you need to do, and that's adding information. If you put some information in a paragraph and want to write something else which supports that or agrees with it or seems the same, then you can use one of the following words and phrases. So you might use in addition, you might use additionally, and you might use moreover. In addition, you might use furthermore. You can also use not only but also, a very nice structure to connect two ideas in the same paragraph. And phrases like another factor or point or issue worth thinking about, worth considering, worth taking into account. You might use a phrase like as well as that or on top of that. And it's possible to use besides that and even what's more. You might not be very keen on what's more because of the apostrophe in what's, but it is possible to use in an IELTS essay. Now let's move on to giving a list of arguments, and here's a nice paragraph. It has a topic sentence and then arguments which support that. And you can see that we've used here firstly, what's more, and lastly. There are other options as well. In this paragraph, we've started with first and foremost, added secondly, and then thirdly and finally. And here we've used in the first place, followed by as well as that, and last but not least. So these are all nice structures, and they make your paragraph very well constructed. Now let's look at describing results. How do you describe the result of something? Well, you can use phrases like as a result and as a consequence. You can also use the adverb consequently at the start of a sentence. And you can use the adjectives consequent and resulting. You can use so or hence, and you can also use therefore, usually at the beginning of a sentence. You can use thus, and also phrases like for that reason, and we can use the verb to mean, something means that, and the verb to lead to, when something leads to or causes something else. Now let's look at reasons, describing the reason for something. So here's an example. Because of the increased number of wars and civil conflicts, there has been a huge rise in the number of refugees seeking safety. So the rise in the number of wars and conflicts is the reason for something else. So we can use because of, and we can use because of when we follow it with a noun or noun phrase. We can use because with a clause, so work in the countryside is so scarce. And we can use since and also on account of the fact that. We can use as and owing to. And owing to is very similar to due to. And we can use a lot of phrases with that clause. So the reason why so many people migrate is that economic conditions in their own countries are so poor. So the information after the that clause gives the reason. We can use so many that, so many with a plural countable noun, so many obstacles, and then after the that clause, most political leaders prefer not to try. This gives the reason. We can use so much, and you can use so much with an uncountable noun like rubbish, and again after the that we have the reason. And we can also use so with adjectives, so unreliable, and after that comes the reason. It's also possible to use so to introduce a reason. Moving on to purpose and why we do things. We can use so as to. Why do you do something? So as to give people the best chance of doing well in life. We can use so as not to, so this has a negative form. Similarly, we can use in order to and in order not to. And we use this structure to introduce the purpose, why we do something or why we don't do something. And we can use with the aim of, with the purpose of, or with the intention of. It's also possible to use so that, and also possible to use to. So we can use to in a similar way to in order to. So the final sentence, many adults who are in full-time employment enroll onto online courses to improve their promotion prospects or in order to improve their promotion prospects. Actually, we could use so as to improve their promotion prospects, or even with the aim, purpose, or intention of improving their promotion prospects. So a lot of these phrases for discussing purpose are interchangeable. Now let's move on to contrast. So when you want to say two things are opposite or very different, you're probably familiar with however and nevertheless. We can use these at the start of a sentence. We can also use in contrast and in sharp contrast. In sharp contrast indicates that there's a very big contrast. And we can use contrastingly at the beginning of a sentence. It's an adverb which we can put between two different pieces of information. We can use in comparison here as well when we want to compare two different things. There's another example of that in a moment. Phrases like there are huge or radical, massive or monumental differences between things allow us to show differences, allow us to show a contrast. And we can use, as we mentioned before, the phrase in comparison when you want to compare two things. And this can be used to contrast them as well. Phrases like some contrary evidence has now emerged, and contrary can be a useful adjective. We can also use opposite as a useful adjective, and the word conversely works very nicely. So as a business, you know that your customers can be your best ambassadors or conversely your worst. So two opposites can be shown with conversely. We can also use instead, and instead can be used when we would like to show two very opposite or different things. And on one hand, and on the other hand works nicely too. And now let's look at concession and let's see what concession actually is. So look at the first sentence here. Despite the significant changes in weather patterns, many so-called experts still deny the possibility of climate change. In this sentence you've got two clauses. The first clause gives you one fact, significant changes in weather patterns. The second clause gives you another fact. People deny the possibility of climate change. And concession happens when you want to say that the main clause, the second fact, is true, even though the first fact seems to contradict it and seems to suggest it might be wrong. So this is quite a common thing that you need to do in English. You can probably do it already because you can probably use sentences with these words, despite and although, which we'll see here. It's very useful, particularly in essays where you're writing from two different perspectives and want to show how one might be better than the other. So we might use despite the fact that, and of course this lets us introduce a phrase beginning with that. So most experts believe money to be a great source of motivation. This is that clause. We can also use in spite of, so we can use this with a noun, in spite of major obstacles, just like despite, so we can follow despite with a noun as well if we want to. And in spite of the fact that we have to follow this with a clause. Happiness is hard to define. We can also use notwithstanding with a noun, so the cost notwithstanding. You may be familiar with although, even though, and whilst or while used in this context as well. They're very useful, and many essays will include a sentence with although and a subordinate clause followed by a main clause, and this is a concession sentence. Now, describing a similarity, and sometimes we want to do this, we can begin a sentence with similarly or likewise, and we can also begin a sentence with phrases like in the same way, or equally, or just as importantly, or equally important. And these are all phrases that you can use to indicate to your reader that the next thing is similar to the last thing. Giving examples is important in IELTS, and of course many candidates use for example, and many candidates use for instance, but there are other ways. You might use the phrase a case in point is, and you might use such as, or including, or like, and we can often use this to introduce nouns or noun phrases. An illustration of this works very well when you'd like to have a sentence illustrating, explaining what you just wrote about. And we can use phrases like perfectly illustrates or perfectly illustrates the point that. So this perfectly illustrates the point that the global economy is unstable. This perfectly exemplifies the weather here, for example. And this is amply or clearly demonstrated by. So these are good phrases too. Also, as can be seen by or as is shown by can be used, and namely. Namely is a little bit different because namely we use when we include all the examples that we could include. We also have notably, chiefly, and mainly when we want to focus on key examples. Now, introducing a new topic, which is something you often want to do, and you can start with the phrase as regards. So as regards the economy means you weren't writing about the economy before, but you are now. With regard or with regards to works very similarly. So with regard to nutrition means that now you are going to start looking at this topic from the viewpoint of nutrition. Turning to is a little more informal, but we can use that as well. And also concerning. We can use as far as something is concerned, as far as the future is concerned, as far as education is concerned. And when we want to introduce a new focus, we can explain using an adverb exactly what this focus is. So economically or financially, then your reader knows that what's coming next is viewed from an economic or financial perspective. Politically works well too. Ethically, morally, or environmentally. So starting with one of these adverbs indicates that the focus of this sentence will be this new topic. Psychologically can be used in a similar way, as can from the perspective of school children, from the perspective of teachers, from the perspective of politicians or environmentalists, and from a teacher's viewpoint or from students' viewpoints. And often we want to give emphasis, so we want to indicate that what we've written is especially important. In that case, we can use phrases like the most compelling evidence is probably that, or a point often overlooked is that. We can use the phrase a point worth emphasizing, a point worth mentioning, a point worth repeating, a point worth reiterating is that. And another key point to emphasize or another key point to mention or note is that. So these are some nice phrases to introduce information which you want to emphasize, you want to repeat or say is especially important. We often want to describe our level of analysis, so we'll show an example. Here we use the word especially, so we mean that we're referring to one particular area. We're being specific, not general, and in a moment you'll see the words specific and general. So we can use specifically here to indicate that we are really referring to those who struggle with academic subjects. We're not talking about everybody. We can use in particular in a similar way to focus on a particular group. And we can also use in general and generally speaking when we're not focusing on a particular group. Our analysis is general. It implies everybody. In general terms works in a similar way. Quite often you want to comment on what you write. So you can use adverbs at the beginning of a sentence, such as significantly or importantly or crucially, to indicate that what you write is very important. Astoundingly or astonishingly, to indicate that it's surprising. You might use bizarrely or remarkably to indicate that it's strange, or obviously, evidently, or clearly to indicate that everybody probably already understands this point. You might use undoubtedly or without a shadow of a doubt to indicate that this is definitely true and that there is no doubt. Quite often you want to summarize, so in a conclusion and occasionally at the end of a long paragraph. So when you summarize, you can write in conclusion and in summary. You can also use to sum up and to conclude. These are all ways of introducing your conclusion. You can use in the final analysis and all things considered, and having weighed up all the arguments, and after having considered this matter in detail, and on balance, as well as on the whole, when you want to start a conclusion. So in certain situations, all of these can be used. There are some typical mistakes which candidates often make when they're using this kind of connecting language, and the first is overuse. So have a look at this, and you can see that we have used firstly, and then in addition, and furthermore, finally, for instance. However, many candidates like to do this because they think it shows that their writing is logical. But what it really shows is that you're not able to use logic and you're having to use signposts. So this is much stronger. You can see far fewer of these phrases used. So it's often a good rule of thumb to have a maximum of 3 in a paragraph. Even 3 is quite excessive sometimes. Second problem is formality, and candidates use words like but and, which are too informal. These are better, much better to use however and additionally. The third error is particularly to do with because, and so let's see some problems with because. Firstly, because the government has increased taxes on alcohol. Well, we can use because when a sentence has 2 parts and we've only got 1 part here. Secondly, because the government has increased taxes on alcohol, the problem of drunkenness was becoming more serious. You can probably see the problem there, that because is with the wrong clause. And finally, because inflation, families are struggling to put food on the table, we can't follow because with a noun on its own. So what should we have written? We can write the government has increased taxes on alcohol because the problem of drunkenness was becoming more serious. Or we could have that sentence with the clauses the other way around, but we need to put because with the problem of drunkenness. And we can use because of with a noun, so because of inflation, families are struggling to put food on the table. And finally, punctuation. Here you can see a problem. Here you can see it's very easily solved. As a general rule, if you start a sentence with an adverb and the adverb refers to the whole sentence, then put a comma after it. There are some things in this video which haven't followed that rule, and that's for grammatical rules I won't really explain now, but be especially careful with things like concessions. So words like although, even though, whilst, despite the fact that these are not followed immediately by commas. But if you have an adverb which refers to the whole sentence like these, then it should have a comma after it. So we hope you found that useful and that now you are more confident connecting your ideas. This will be great for your coherence and cohesion grade. You probably don't want to watch this video again, but mercifully there is a PDF and you might take a copy of that to help you prepare. We look forward to seeing you soon and thank you for watching.